So just FYI, just started. We'll be recording this and I'll post it later. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them via the chat button in Zoom. Just type in question, colon, and then type in your question. We will record all the questions that you have and ask them. And with that, I'd like to introduce Turquoise Baker from the Brennan Center for Justice. And she is a research and program associate there, associate with the NY School of Law. She focuses on election security. Prior to that, she worked at the Waverly Main Street Digital and Inclusive Excellence Fellow for the Association of Research Libraries. So I will stop sharing, and Turquoise, thank you very much for joining us, and go ahead.
Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen.
While you're doing that, Turquoise, if I could just ask everyone to please mute yourselves so that we only hear Turquoise. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And just to check, is everyone able to see the main title slide? Are you seeing any notes or anything like that? I apologize, I'm unable to see anyone. So if there's
hey Turquoise, we see your notes slide.
Oh, okay, that's all right. And
there you go. Now I see the PowerPoint.
Just a PowerPoint, okay. Apologies for that, folks. If you wouldn't mind giving me just one moment. Okay, are you still able to see the note slide or the main title slide?
Yes.
Okay, great.
We can still see the entire slide.
Okay. We'll have to do the presentation this way. I apologize. My notes seem to not be formatted correctly. Apologize for the inconvenience, but we will continue and we will power on. Hello, my name is Turquoise Baker. I hope you are all doing well. I'm a research and program associate at the Brennan Center for Justice. On June 16th, the Brennan Center, in collaboration with the Bipartisan Policy Center, published a report entitled Election Officials Under Attack. I'll be discussing the primary components of this paper in today's presentation. So before we begin, I'd like to give a quick overview of the Brennan Center, our mission, and what we do. So the Brennan Center is an independent, nonpartisan law and policy organization that works to reform, revitalize, and when necessary, defend our country's systems of democracy and justice. Our work takes many shapes and forms. We are part think tank, part advocacy group, and part communications hub. Each component of our organizational structure allows us to carry out our mission effectively and reach all necessary stakeholders to make a positive change in our democracy. So we have a pretty packed agenda today. We'll try to be brief and leave time for questions, but we'll start with a quick overview of who our election officials are. We'll talk a bit more about the context of this conversation, what's going on, what we're seeing, what has changed over the past few years. Next, we'll jump.
Can we interrupt 1 second? We can only see half of your slide. Your slide is not showing properly on the screen.
Okay.
There you go. That fixed it. Whatever you just did. Oh, no.
Nope, we can't see the whole slide.
You still can't see the whole slide?
Now we can see most of it, at least the whole slide, yeah.
Okay.
That's perfect right there. There was just another application I think you weren't sharing that was blocking it, and when you it fixed it. I guess
Thank you. I'm so sorry about this, folks. I appreciate your patience. Okay. Is that all right?
Looks good.
Thank you so much. So yeah, we'll talk about what has changed. We'll jump into our process of actually creating the reports and the 4 categories addressed in the report, which are violent threats and personal safety, disinformation, partisan and policy interference, and lastly, talent pool challenges. For each category, we'll discuss major problems and a few experiences of election officials that are relevant to each. We'll also discuss the primary recommendations included in the report. And we'll have a brief discussion on what everyday people can do to protect and support our election officials. And we'll end with a period for questions as well. So about our election officials, there are thousands of election officials across the United States. And broadly speaking, they are tasked with overseeing our elections. However, there's quite a bit of variation between election officials. And as I'm sure that many of you on this call know, by nature of being, working or at least, familiar with the Secure Elections Network, election officials go by many names. There are clerks, registrars, directors, secretaries of state, auditors, commissioners, and the list goes on. Many election officials, especially those in smaller jurisdictions, oversee matters related to or unrelated to elections. And we'll talk a bit more about that later in the presentation. Still, despite the variety within the election official cohort, the bottom line is that election officials, who are the backbone of our democracy, safely, securely, and fairly administer our elections. So what's happening now? Well, according to a Pew Research study released in February 2020, in 1958, about 3/4 of Americans expressed trust in government in Washington to do what's right. As of February 2020, that number has dropped to 17%. This decrease in trust is impacting our election officials who, by no fault of their own, are losing the trust of the public and have become targets of those unwilling to accept the results of certain elections. Some people are seeking to delegitimize election officials themselves to sow doubt in our election results. This loss in trust has real-world implications, many of which we aim to address in this report. So this report was nearly 5 months in the making. We began in February 2021 by interviewing dozens of election officials. We asked about their experiences during the 2020 election, how they dealt with the pandemic, staff shortages, attacks against themselves, their staffs, their families, keeping up with social media, mis and disinformation, and countless other topics. And following these interviews, we held sessions consisting of election officials and other elections, cybersecurity, and social media experts and academics. These moderated discussions gave us the opportunity to dig deeper into some of the most common themes that arose during our interviews. Finally, we began drafting the report, and we received input from election officials during the drafting and the final stages of the process. We ultimately landed on these 4 categories, as you can see on your screen. The report is by no means an exhaustive list of all the issue areas or all the possible solutions to those issue areas, but there's only so much you can fit in 184 footnotes and about 40 pages of writing. So this is what we got. But however, we find that the explanations of these main problems and the recommendations that we propose are a really good starting place to tackling some of these issues. So we'll begin with the first section of the report, violent threats and personal safety. So while I can certainly explain some of the horrors that election officials faced over the past several months, it's frankly best to hear from them directly. So in conjunction with the report, we released the following video I'll show in just a moment, which features election officials themselves documenting or discussing their experiences. And this was a huge project. Really have to shout out our fantastic comms team, Lisa Vosper, especially Deputy Director in Multimedia Communications, who did a fantastic job with this video, which I will play now.
He will demand the truth, and you will pay for your lying remarks, you liberal lying rhino. We will take you out. Your family, your life, you watch your back.
They had assault rifles.
A pipe bomb.
You're gonna get what's coming to you.
They threatened my life.
Couldn't go anywhere without the police officers.
When we had officers on the roof of our building.
We had go bags ready for my family and my children.
We recognized that the divisiveness in our country was really growing. We also recognized the role that social media was playing.
I had never, ever had that before. I'd never had people so engaged and enraged about what we were doing just to ensure that people could vote.
There were people who showed up outside of election officials' houses, armed, people that showed up outside of offices, threatening phone calls, harassment.
And online discussions about types of ammunition and guns to use on me.
It became a daily occurrence outside of our facility to have anywhere from 50 to 150 individuals outside. Some of them were armed.
There was a fence sort of separating the building from the protesters. And they were armed.
We were terribly concerned about every threat, everything that was said, because we just didn't know.
I was encountered with a partisan operative campaign manager with his cell phone, where he videotaped me hurling insults and accusations. It had over 400,000 views. Commenters were saying we should find out where she lives. We should hang her for treason. She should be shot.
This is not what I expect to have to really run and fight for my life.
My son began getting threats that were intended for me.
They're leaving their families and their loved ones to come and do a job that was supposed to be just to count votes or to administer an election.
We actually had a record number of turnouts of people that came out in a pandemic.
Everything that you had written in a playbook as far as like how you normally do things in an election cycle had to be set aside.
It makes one pause and say, is this really what I want to do?
This to me was an effort to undermine confidence in our entire electoral process.
We think about that happening in other places around the world, but that's happened in the United States, and it's happened specifically because of the big lie.
Election officials are in this for passion, for service.
The public servants all around this country that run our elections at the state and local level. They don't do this job to get rich, and they care more about the integrity of elections than anyone I know.
So the experiences of election officials in this video are far from outliers. The Brennan Center commissioned a survey of election officials by the Brennan Strategy Group. And according to that survey, 1 in 3 election officials said that they felt unsafe because of their job, and nearly 1 in 5 listed threats to their lives as a job-related concern. So there are several solutions to these problems. I'll go over a handful today, but encourage you all to take a look at the reports and the checklist, which is an abbreviated version of the report for more information on anything we discuss if we don't have time to get to it at the end. But first, I'd like to talk about the Department of Justice Task Force. Many election officials expressed their frustration that individuals who harass EOs or election officials and their families are rarely prosecuted or otherwise held accountable. Furthermore, they were concerned that the lack of prosecution would normalize aggression against election officials. A DOJ task force could, in conjunction with federal, state, and local entities and election officials themselves, directly address these issues. On June 25th.
What was he doing?
I'm sorry? Oh, I believe someone is. All right, thank you. On June 25th, the Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, issued a memorandum announcing the launch of a task force that could address the, quote, rise in threats against election officials. This is fantastic news, and we are eager to see the progress and additional announcements about these efforts from the task force moving forward. Our next recommendation was the passing of new state laws to provide greater personal security for election officials and workers. It's important to recognize that election officials didn't just face threats in their offices. These threats and attacks often came home with them. Their homes and faces, the homes and faces of several election officials were posted in crosshairs along with their address on a website called Enemies of the People. One election official who experienced threats against her life spent her own money to secure her home. And after police officers surveyed her residence, they recommended she purchase a Ring doorbell, which can show the owner who's outside of their property. However, she was unable to afford the extra safety precaution. Nearly 80% of election officials surveyed in the Brennan Group survey stated that the government should provide security protection to election officials when needed. And there are models for laws that could do this, like the Daniel Anderl Judicial Security and Privacy Act of 2020, introduced in New Jersey. This act proposes measures to improve personal safety measures to federal judges, including grants to purchase home intrusion detection systems and training and education about how to maintain greater personal safety. Laws like this would be extremely beneficial to election officials and their families. Another recommendation for government officials is implementing processes to ensure swift investigation and, when necessary, prosecution of those responsible for threats and attacks. In Nevada, Clark County Registrar of Voters Joe Gloria recounted that 25 to 50 protesters appeared outside his office every day in the few days leading up to the election, some openly carrying weapons, leading him to provide meals for his staff so that they did not have to leave the building during the workday. When they did leave, protesters harassed them in the parking lot. Several election officials have and continue to receive death threats for simply doing their jobs. Others have actually gone into hiding as they have been so fearful about the threats against their families and themselves. States must revamp their processes for responding to threats and harassment against election workers and should establish clear standards for how to do so and clear standards for when to investigate these types of actions. Government should also work with healthcare professionals to assist election workers and family members in developing coping mechanisms for dealing with these horrific threats and attacks. We also have a series of recommendations for election officials themselves. Tabletop exercises are facilitator-guided discussion-based sessions about what are often worst case or likely scenarios. Lisa Dealey, Philadelphia City Commissioner, noted that 99% of the worst case scenarios covered in a tabletop exercise that she attended actually happened, but the preparation beforehand enabled her colleagues, and law enforcement to protect their election workers. We recommend that election officials participate in these exercises. Another recommendation for election officials is to build their relationships with law enforcement. Many EOs express their appreciation for their partnership with local law enforcement during the election cycle, but there's always room for improvement. Neil Kelly, Registrar of Voters in Orange County, California, developed a pocket guide for local law enforcement with critical information on election laws and voter intimidation. Officials in nearly 20 states around the country have used this model and adapted it to their own jurisdictions with great success. These guides give EOs the opportunity to educate law enforcement about the need to be sensitive about showing up to polling locations and can strengthen the partnership between law enforcement and EOs in the long run. Election officials can also take several steps to protect their personal information. They can scrub and close old accounts and create alternative public-facing contact information. This can mitigate the threat of doxing and the impact of doxing if it has occurred. So next we have disinformation, and this was one of the most complex issues that we tried to tackle in the report. There is no one way to approach this topic, nor is there one way to solve the issues that arise from misinformation or disinformation. However, the recommendations that are included in the report are a good place to start. So first, to quickly discuss the problem. There are people who intentionally disseminate lies or spread disinformation, and there are those who unknowingly spread erroneous information without knowing it was false, which is the spread of misinformation. I'll be using disinformation as a blanket term in this presentation, but it's important to recognize that both mis and disinformation can negatively impact our election officials. The past election cycle and still today, EOs have struggled to respond to the large swaths of disinformation that have taken social media and even news media by storm. Calls into election offices can be time-consuming and put a serious strain on election officials who are already short-staffed. Many election officials cited a direct link between election disinformation and the violence and threats they experienced during the 2020 election. And according to the Brennan Strategy Group survey, 54% of election officials surveyed believe that social media has made their job more dangerous. Again, we have several solutions. We won't go through them all at length, but there's quite a few that are worth highlighting here. One of our main recommendations is the creation of a directory for all election officials in the nation for internet companies, social media agencies to use. The directory should include every election office, jurisdiction, location, and information about the official websites and social media handles for those election offices. Many EOs had difficulty disseminating accurate information during this past election cycle by, for example, purchasing ads to educate the public. Rules on political ads on social media platforms were meant to govern electioneering advocacy, but actually stymied the efforts of many election officials. With a more formal directory of EOs, internet companies could systematically amplify official content from election officials or provide free ads for election offices. The directory could also be used for outreach to officials to offer assistance with content creation or opportunities for social media training. Internet companies should also form an information sharing and analysis center or organization, or ISAC or ISAO, to track mis and disinformation trends and disseminate that information between platforms. These trends could even inform rumor control pages like the one CISA created, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, quite a mouthful, or websites like justthefacts.vote, which is a new rumor control and myth busting page created and run by the Maricopa County Department of Elections. Federal and state governments also play a huge role in this. One big recommendation of ours is to require party monitor and training accountability. Party monitors are often present at polling places and warehouse where ballots are counted, and even during post-election audits. Unfortunately, these monitors became a source of mis and disinformation during this past election cycle. Many times this would be due to misunderstandings. For instance, a monitor who witnesses an election worker fixing a paper jam of a ballot counting machine may think that a ballot is being counted twice. They may hear other terms pertaining to how an election is run and come to their own erroneous conclusions. Trainings, even on simple vocabulary, could reduce the spread of misinformation. And if a monitor is acting inappropriately, for instance, taking photographs of election workers' license plates, which really did happen, they should be held accountable. Furthermore, regulations and state or federal guidance should delineate what is acceptable and unacceptable conduct for party monitors. Lastly, we have the election officials themselves. EOs can create crisis communication plans to manage the spread of or counter misinformation. By having these plans ready in advance, election officials can respond quickly, confidently, and transparently to disinformation. They can also work with national associations like the National Association of Secretaries of States, the National Association of State Election Directors, and the National Association of Election Officials, and work with them on efforts to educate the public about election processes in their respective jurisdictions. So next we have partisan and policy interference. So this is definitely a newer but equally horrific and extraordinary threat to our democracy. During and after the 2020 November election, several political actors have sought to sway election officials or otherwise compel them to subvert their election duties. Among the most infamous of these efforts was when former President Trump called Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in an effort to coerce him to, quote, find 11,780 votes. There's also the Arizona Partisan Review, which was, or rather is commissioned by the Arizona State Senate and conducted by Cyber Ninjas, a grossly unqualified, partisan, and ill-equipped firm. Cyber Ninjas was tasked with reviewing ballots cast in Maricopa County during the 2020 November election. Following a series of subpoenas and court dates, the Maricopa County Elections Department handed over the ballots and other election materials for inspection. Secretary of State Katie Hobbs recruited 3 nonpartisan election experts, one of which included the Brennan Center's Elizabeth Howard, senior counsel, also on the election security team like myself, to observe these proceedings, which were about as uncoordinated and dysfunctional as one could imagine. Unable to trust the security of the voting machines handled by Cyber Ninjas during the review, the county is refusing to use the machines in future elections. The Maricopa County Elections Department, the Secretary of State's office, and organizations like the Brennan Center, in addition to other grassroots organizations on the ground, continue to combat the disinformation being spread about the partisan review, which notably I'm intentionally not calling an audit as to not legitimize it. Unfortunately, partisan actors in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Florida, and others are following Arizona's example. The Brennan Center, in partnership with the R Street Institute and Protect Democracy, published a report entitled Partisan Election Review Efforts in 5 States, which has more information on the threat that these reviews can actually pose to our democracy. We are also seeing a concerning rise in legislation that would usurp power from and even criminalize local election officials for simple mistakes. In Arizona, a bill was introduced that gives the Attorney General the, quote, sole authority, end quote, to defend state election laws rather than the Secretary of State, who is the chief election official. SF 413 in Iowa imposes criminal penalties on election officials for proactively sending mail ballot applications to voters. There are also efforts to defund election administration. Bills in states like Arkansas, Indiana, North Dakota, and Tennessee prohibit election officials from accepting private funding, like the Center for Tech and Civic Life funding that many officials said was instrumental to their ability to run an election during the pandemic. Some are even going so far as to refuse to pay for voting machines, even if they were already approved for use by the jurisdiction. So there are no easy answers for this issue, but as in classic Brennan Center fashion, we have several recommendations. One thing that state and local lawmakers, or state and federal, lawmakers can do is make sure that election officials have adequate legal support. During our interviews, many EOs mentioned that they didn't feel like they had the legal support necessary to help prevent errors as they implement increasingly complex election laws, or the legal support to defend themselves in the event that they are subject to politically motivated investigations or litigation. Prohibiting off-the-record communications with those who certify elections is also important. States should require that officials who receive unsolicited communication direct the individual to the appropriate public process and publicly disclose that communication. This would at least ensure that there's a clear public record of this advocacy and make it less likely that political actors would use coercive tactics. And, well, very importantly, state and federal lawmakers must fully fund election administration. This speaks for itself, but I still find it extremely necessary to stress this point. State and local lawmakers need to make sure that election administration is well funded, that the funding actually reaches local election officials, and that it isn't easy to threaten or even withhold the funding and resources that election administrators need to run our elections. Election officials can also play a role in preventing or at least managing partisan and party interference. For example, EOs can create a robust code of ethics that could highlight ethical guidelines and establish best practices for dealing with partisan interference. They could also provide a public rationale to explain the decisions of local election officials. There are more and more lawyers who are willing to defend EOs, so state election official associations should tap into that energy and help organize pro bono legal representation for EOs. There's also room to make structural changes to insulate election administrators. There isn't quite a consensus on how to do this amongst the people we interviewed, but generally ensuring that EOs are treated as independent from legislative or executive branches of government is critical to this work. And now we'll move on to the final category of the day, talent pool challenges. So if you take anything from this presentation, is that election officials have a very hard job, but many people don't actually realize that their job requires a mastery of dozens of competencies, or that many election officials do things other than administer elections. The Election Assistance Commission created a wheel of election administrator competencies, which is overwhelming for anyone who is outside of or even within the election space. Furthermore, many EOs will also oversee cemeteries, city councils, cattle brands, public records, liquor licenses, and more, in addition to these responsibilities. However, despite this heavy workload, election offices are staffed with very few people and may administer 4 or more elections a year. This means that they don't have a lot of time to recuperate. One local election official said that she and her team worked 70 to 80 hours a week for 2.5 months. Another local election official reported working 110-hour weeks for 6 weeks straight during the 2020 election cycle. So the Democracy Fund published a study early last year about a series of surveys of election officials, or local election officials rather, and a few of their findings are up on the screen here. So despite the heavy workload, just over 45% of LEOs from jurisdictions of 5,000 or fewer registered voters reported that they are paid less than $35,000 a year. Over a quarter reported that they are paid less than $20,000 a year. Roughly 75% of local election official respondents were older than 50. 1/4 were over the age of 65. And the vast majority of respondents identified as white. So there are several things that need to be addressed here. Election officials are overworked. Election officials have dozens of responsibilities and are poorly compensated for their work. And the population of election officials is hardly representative of the populations that they're serving. Government and election officials should address local staffing and resource needs by recruiting backup workers, volunteer or temporary staff to support EOs during election cycles, and share staff who specialize in matters like logistics, IT, law, communications between jurisdictions. In light of the rise in harassment of election officials and election workers, including gendered and racist attacks, all election officials must address the problem of harassment by members of the public, tailoring materials to different jurisdictions and election offices as needed. They can also show appreciation for election officials. Many election officials that we spoke to were extremely disheartened by the response of the public after they ran what was deemed the most, or correctly deemed the most secure election in our nation's history. Election officials need a morale boost, and frankly, a morale boost is long overdue. Election officials can leverage existing professional networks to improve job quality. This entails working with state associations and encouraging them to hire staff who represent their interests. They can also advocate for national policies with entities that can better amplify their voices. To diversify the field, state and local election officials can proactively reach out and partner with colleges and universities, as well as internship and fellowship programs, especially within communities of color. These efforts can introduce young people to a profession with an older population, help immediate staffing shortages, and expand the number of candidates with the skill and knowledge for future jobs as EOs, all while making the position more representative. Lastly, where election officials are elected or appointed, jurisdictions should work with groups that support diverse candidates. Nonpartisan groups like the Campaign School at Yale University and Rutgers University's Ready to Run programs should create trainings and develop resources specifically for those looking to enter election administration, covering what the positions entail and steps that can be taken to set oneself up for success. So what can you do? Obviously, not everyone is an election official, an employee at a large, social media company, or a government worker. But there are still things that everyone can do to really support and protect our election officials. First and foremost, figure out who your election official is. A lot of people don't know. A lot of people didn't know there were election officials before this election cycle. So that's really the first step when it comes to getting involved. Sharing your local election officials' social media posts, or if they have a website, sharing that, and let your followers know that they are a trusted source. As I mentioned earlier, many election officials had trouble breaking through all of the noise on social media, and it can be quite loud. So helping to amplify their voices can be, a seemingly small but really impactful way to support them. Become a poll worker. During our interviews, many election officials said that poll workers became their most outspoken advocates in their own communities when there's a lot of disinformation buzzing around. Educating your friends, colleagues, and peers, having those quick, 5-minute Zoom conversations about what they can do about, who their election officials are can be really important. Asking questions. It's okay not to know. I'm learning every single day more about election administration, election security. And asking those questions rather than coming to conclusions is just as important as, amplifying the correct information. Spreading the word about or applying to election internships, fellowships, and other mentor programs and positions. This is super important too, especially for younger people who are interested in getting into space. One of the best things that came out of this election cycle is that there were so many young students, especially college students, who were really mobilized and came out to support their election officials and support their communities and help out and get out the vote. Really exposing these people to these types of opportunities is so important. And lastly, reaching out to government representatives. So this definitely may vary depending on what you're, whether or not you're acting in an official capacity or not. But letting your government representatives know that you appreciate your election officials, that you know of recommendations that could improve their lives, that you perhaps disagree with some recommendations or some laws that would harm election officials and their efforts to support their communities. So all of these options, if you can do one, great. If you can do them all, fantastic. But this is definitely a great place to start if you're willing and looking to become more involved. So the bottom line is election officials are the backbone of our democracy, and they safely, securely, and fairly administer our elections. There is no easy way to answer the question, how do we protect our election officials when they're under attack? As this lengthy presentation will probably show you. But these 4 categories, violent threats, disinformation, partisan and policy interference, and talent pool challenges, are really a great way to kind of get at the core of some of the biggest issues that, according to election officials themselves, are really plaguing them and the space that we're in. So that is my presentation for today. Thank you all so much for being here and for listening to me ramble on. I will stop sharing my screen momentarily. I believe we will have a pretty good chunk of time for questions. Let's see.
Yes, thanks very much, Turquoise. Let's go ahead and jump right into questions. And so bear with me a second. So the first question is from Deborah Garvey, who asks, can you explain a bit further the role of the Department of Justice Task Force in addressing threats against election workers?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that question. The Department of Justice would really serve as an organizing body. The task force, and I was fairly vague in my description, so thank you for bringing this question up, but would include several different organizations. It would include organizations like CISA, Department of Homeland Security, election officials, local law enforcement, state law enforcement, attorneys generals, various parties would be involved. There are other models that we modeled this idea off of that are really meant to bring a bunch of main stakeholders together and powerful entities together to address these issues. So more than anything, I would say that the Department of Justice is the main mobilizing force, but would not be the sole entity tasked with reacting or responding to these threats and attacks against election officials. And I'm happy to be more specific if need be. I understand we have a few questions, but.
Helen Stewart asks, was this the first time in history that this level of threats were leveled against election officials and workers?
Good question. I'm not aware of a time in history where election officials specifically were as targeted as they are now. I find that social media is especially was a conduit for most of these attacks, and the rise in social media is really one of the reasons why I'd say these attacks have been magnified in the way that they have. In previous years, though, election officials were definitely among the most respected and trusted government officials in their communities. I can't remember the exact study at this moment, but there was a Pew Research study that looked at this and found that the vast majority of people trusted their election officials in their local communities, to run them effectively and run them securely and safety and well. And that has changed drastically. So while now I'm very curious, I'll certainly be doing a bit more historical research on this. But no, as far as I know, there has not been something this horrific, I would say, an attack of this nature against election officials.
Eoin asks, can these tactics for protecting officials work effectively with only local and state resources? Do they require federal funding to work effectively?
Great question. I would say that a lot of these do. I think that a lot of election officials were fortunate to have support of private organizations and companies during this past election cycle. Many businesses were willing to donate PPE, resources to pay their employees if they chose to take a day off to work on election day. So I think a lot of the success that we saw in 2020 can be attributed to that, in addition to, like I mentioned earlier, the CTCL Center for Civic Life funding, in addition to other types of private funding. Congress definitely needs to fund our election administration. In the future, we can't guarantee that we'll have this out. And I think that federal funding is really important and necessary for us to save our democracy.
Okay, the next question is from Ken Barnes, who asks, isn't it a crime, either federal or state, to harass, threaten, or intimidate election officials? Why weren't all these protesters arrested and prosecuted right away on the lawns of election officials? Why do we have to wait for a special report from the highest levels?
Thank you, Ken. Great question, and frankly, one that we at the Brennan Center are also grappling with. Yes, it is illegal to harass government workers in this way. I cannot remember the exact specific government statute at this moment. But frankly, one of the reasons why we didn't see as much prosecution as one may expect was simply the volume of the harassment. Many election workers who were working on the phones, in call centers, or even in local election offices mentioned that they would get hundreds of calls a day, being harassed. And frankly, in some cases, they don't have time to report every single harassing or threatening call. In other cases, election officials don't know what resources they have access to. In other cases, they're simply scared. I will say that there is a lot of momentum around this issue. That seeing the DOJ begin this process of creating a task force is really speaks to their intention to address this more forcefully and more intentionally. And hopefully we'll see that in the future. But unfortunately, I think, Ken, I'm in a similar situation as you, where I'm equally frustrated and somewhat perplexed by the lack of response. I apologize for not giving a more thorough or hopeful answer on that.
Okay, the next question is from Donna Plunkett. What is occurring with voter suppression subversion at the state level, in my opinion, is abuse of the officials by many state elected officials? And she asks, is it time for federal action in establishing baseline rules and procedures states must meet?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, Georgia, states like Georgia and Texas, and frankly, many others all across the nation have really been reactive in their response to the 2020 election with really restrictive voter suppression laws. You can check the voter roundup or the election law roundup that the Brennan Center does every month or so. Whether or not it's time for more action on the federal level, I think there definitely is room for that. I think that at the end of the day, I think there's room for that. I think, there are efforts like the For the People Act that would address many issues that election officials have raised on a broader, grander scale, and that type of intervention is effective and is appropriate. in the face of these types of attacks.
The next question is from Jed Parker. With state legislatures moving to overturn the work of election officials, how can we expect support to election officials on the state level? And he also asks, is the video that you available, publicly available? I guess the one that you played earlier.
Yes, the video is definitely publicly available. There's a 3-minute version, which you saw today, and a 7-minute version, which I believe is somewhere on our website or at least on YouTube. In terms of the first part or your initial question. Actually, John, would you mind repeating the first part of the question? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll post it in the chat too. Hang on. The question is, with state legislatures moving to overturn the work of election officials, how can we expect to support election officials on the state level?
Right. That's a very good question. I think in many ways, it's similar to how you would support your local election officials. It's, writing to government officials that you support them. It's sharing their social media accounts and messages. It's, telling people about them. I think a lot of this comes from that type of action. I would say that there definitely is also, that there definitely is also momentum amongst state election officials themselves, organizations like NASED, National Association of State Election Directors, and NAS, the National Association of Secretaries of State, that are also working very diligently to support each other. And I'm sure there are ways that you can get involved in supporting those organizations as well. But yeah, I would say that in many cases, the ways that you can support your local election officials can also apply to the ways that you can support your state election officials as well.
The next question comes from Charles Spence. What hope do you have for widespread mail-in voting, which would eliminate many of these issues?
I'm very hopeful for widespread mail-in voting. I think that the absentee voting wave that we saw was one of the most spectacular things that came out of this election cycle, not only for public health and safety, but just in changing the way that we see civic engagement. I think that despite the outcry at it that we've seen during the 2020 election cycle and now, I think many people will be reluctant to part with it. I think people will be adamant in advocating for it. And I still see it as a viable and very successful means of voting in the future. So while it will be certainly an uphill battle when it comes to fighting some of these voter suppression laws, I think that the people and election officials and many other parties and entities as well will hold fast to this method of voting. So I'm very hopeful for it.
The next question comes from Martha Nakajima. Is there a place for counter demonstrations of support for election officials? I'll post that in the chat.
Or what?
I guess she's asking, I think what my interpretation, and Martha, you feel free to chime in here, is that you're just wondering, is there some sort of group or website or some method for channeling support for election officials, some activist group or something? Martha, did you want to clarify? You can either clarify in chat or just come off of your mute if you want.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay, thank you, Martha, for that question. I definitely think there are. I would say what I would recommend is looking locally. I think what we've seen in Arizona, for example, amidst these partisan reviews, is a lot of grassroots organizations have been becoming more, not necessarily like they weren't involved before, but really, really pushing forward in calls and advocacy and getting people involved. I think we'll see more of that, and that will come to light more as tragically more suppressive laws are introduced and hopefully not, but possibly passed. But I would definitely look locally. I'd check with your local election official if they have anything. But yeah, local is probably the best way to go.
Okay, the next question comes from Helen Stewart. And the question is, isn't a directory of EOs, election officials, a two-edged sword? Easily hackable and even a guidepost to find and threaten these officials on the part of bad actors?
Great question. I think that the entity that would be, I guess, would have the key for this directory would be CISA, which is a Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is more than capable of protecting such a directory, such a large amount of information. Like everything that is digital, there's always a risk of something being hacked, something being infiltrated. But frankly, we find that the risk to election officials of not having the resources they need, of not being able to have their voices amplified, exceeds that risk. And we find that that risk is relatively smaller than what may be expected. But yeah, the organization that would house such a directory is extraordinarily resilient and capable of keeping that close to the chest.
Tim White asks, is the publishing of the anonymous ballot images the only evidence that counts, a central part of the solution, and an alternative to hardening elections? So in other words, he's stating that the only evidence that really counts are the anonymous ballot images, and is publishing them a central part of the solution. And he also asks, noting that when the public has the same information as administrator, there's no reason to target them. I'll put that in a chat.
Thank you.
It's a lot.
No rush.
There you go.
Okay, it's publishing of the anonymous ballot images, the only evidence that counts. And to hardening elections, the public has the same information. John, I apologize. I'm not entirely sure I understand your question here. I would agree that, okay, thank you. I would say that largely speaking, the election officials are extraordinarily transparent. And despite the transparency that they have shown over the past, several decades, but specifically speaking, the past 18 months or so, their targets have continued. And I'd say the disinformation has been perpetuated despite their transparency and despite their willingness to show the public what happens in audits and what happens in elections. The publishing of anonymous ballot images, I find that would be subject to the same level of scrutiny and frankly disbelief that many already hold when they see other forms of information that election officials themselves will release. I'm not sure, I don't know if I have the necessary expertise to speak whether that's a central part of the solution, but I will say that a general approach of combating disinformation is the best way to really address what I believe is at the core of your question. That was a bit rambly, I recognize, but I hope that somewhat gets to the core of what you're trying to ask.
Okay, we have a final question. Oh, I guess that was just me echoing. Anyway, the final question is, we should wrap up since we're approaching 8 o'clock, comes from Yon. I'll just post it in here. He's asking, can you address the changes being proposed in the voter suppression bills that are coming out of states like Texas and Georgia, which don't just place criminal penalties on election officials, but also open the door to parties being able to replace them with explicitly partisan individuals?
Absolutely. And this is definitely something that we haven't seen, and at least I haven't seen before, albeit I'm very young, but I still think that stands. Yes, we're seeing this in Georgia, seeing this in Arizona, where either laws are replacing election officials, like the chief election official, like a secretary of state, removing them from positions of power pertaining to elections, or even changing who has disciplinary power over local election officials. And this is absolutely atrocious. Election officials are the best experts. Election officials know what they're doing. And frankly, these efforts, these types of voter suppression bills and this usurpation, apologies, that's not the right word, but and taking power away from them is clearly a partisan power grab. It will be difficult in many ways to counter these types of laws if passed, but there are definitely folks who are trying to find ways to either fight against them or at least find alternatives to better support our election officials. Oh, and I see you typed that you're most concerned about partisan hires. That's also a concern that we have as well. It seems that the election official position is becoming much more appealing to those who find that that would be a successful or a even profitable avenue for abusing our election system, which is horrific. That's one of the reasons why that we recommend, really pushing for election workers, new people to get into this space, to take part in internships, partnerships, other college and university programs, to get into those spaces. Election officials by and large are a phenomenal group of people. Like the video said, they're not in it to get rich, they're in it to serve their country. And definitely it'll be a big task and an important task in the next, next year, next 4 years, next 10 years, to recruit people and to encourage people who fall into that category to apply for these positions and to protect our democracy.
Well, that concludes our discussion for today. Turquoise Baker, thank you very much for this very informative discussion. And I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and let Stephanie wrap us up.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Okay, so follow-up actions that Turquoise recommends for us all to do. First and foremost, if you've not done it yet, please reach out to your local election officials to thank them for their work and to let them know that you support them. I went with someone from Common Cause to see our local election officials. We took balloons and a little poster. It was a spur of the moment, very little thing, but I cannot tell you, everyone in that office, it was during COVID, so everyone in that office came outside because they were so excited. Thank you for coming to see us. Thank you for supporting us. One person can make a huge difference. So please reach out to your local officials. Second, volunteer, sign up to be a poll worker. They are desperately needed. Our poll workers are on probably average age of 65 or more. They need people willing to do this job. 3, recognize that attacks on election officials are attacks on our democracy. I'm going to repeat that one because it is so very important. Attacks on election officials are attacks on our democracy. Our democracy relies on its citizens being able to choose their elected officials. If the sanctity of the vote is threatened, our democracy is threatened. Finally, rely on information from credible sources, i.e. your local election office, the U.S., the EAC, U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, to educate yourself, to support your election officials, and to counter disinformation. And with that, I thank you all for coming. Turquoise, I can't thank you enough for your time this evening. Excellent presentation. Just to let you all know, you will be receiving a copy of the slide deck and the recording within the next few days. Thank you so much. Oh, and it will also have the link to the longer video. Spoiler alert, it's very upsetting. Okay, thank you all very much for coming. Have a great rest of your Sunday evening. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Turquoise. Did you have any final things you wanted to share? I meant to ask you earlier and forgot.
Oh, no, just thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our election officials do too.
All right. John, should we go out and come back? Should I end it and then we'll come back, or do you think people will
Well,
just leave?
No, we should end it. And then if you wanted to do, I don't know, we can hop on a conference call.